misconceptions about turbos, and in particular turbo lag. A lot of people have this idea of turbo lag as if it's completely dependent on the revs that the car's doing at the particular point in time. So there's always an argument about which is more fun to drive and which is better. I don't think it's as clear cut as one is better than the other or more fun than the other. They both have their pros and cons. You know, obviously a turbo is going to give you a lot more torque, especially low down in the rev range. Well, depending on the setup, of course. It's also going to give you good power, depending on the setup. Whereas a naturally aspirated car, obviously, is going to give you linear and consistent power delivery everywhere inside the rev range and everywhere based on throttle position as well. So not just RPM, but also throttle position. So there's kind of two camps of thought usually. Not everyone is black and white, but usually you've got the people who say, no, turbos are terrible because you can't predict the power based on the throttle, based on the revs, all those sorts of things. They're sort of the people who want really perfect throttle balance, and they want that perfect control over the car. Usually, you're more likely to see that being important or desirable in rear-wheel drive cars because they're the sort of cars that really need that precise throttle control. And then the opposite side of that is people who say naturally aspirated is terrible, turbos give you tons of boost, tons of power, and that's awesome. And it is tons of fun to be on boost in a car that has a turbo, but it does actually suffer from the response issues that the purists lament. I don't know if I can actually use the word lament without being seen as an absolute dickhead, so I'm going to say complain about. One of the mitigating factors that people who want turbos or like turbos say is that once you're above a certain rev range, it doesn't matter because there's no lag. And that's not true, because the spool of the turbo is based on the flow of the gas going through the turbine. And that gas, or the amount of gas that's coming through the turbine and basically being produced by the engine, is based on both revs and throttle position, and actually the current boost of the turbo. So those three things factor in to the boost that you'll be producing at any given point in time. So that's quite easy to see on a car like this one. So this is a 2018 RS3. It has a decent sized turbo to literage ratio. So obviously the bigger the engine, the easier it is to spool up a turbo of a given size, because you can push more air through it and you can spool it up quicker. So this is a 2.5 litre 5-cylinder, and it has a reasonably large factory turbo compared to most cars. However, it doesn't really suffer from horrible lag. One important factor is it can make maximum boost at 2000 RPM. So that means, in theory, according to some, it has no lag, because when are you driving below 2000 RPM? See, I was just above 2000 right now, and I'm in comfort mode and auto, so I would have been making maximum boost. No, that's not the case. Boost takes time to build at anywhere on the rev range. I was hesitant to say that because it might actually be right up there at super high revs. But in this car, it will. If you're doing 6000 RPM and just lightly on the throttle, the boost will be not at maximum. In fact, you won't even be close. It'll be like probably 5 or 10% of max boost. Some cars actually do reach their maximum boost without added throttle, or they come very close to it. And especially cars that have very small turbos and very big engines. So for example, the Ferrari 488 GTB has a large V8 engine and two very small turbos. So its turbos are very close to maximum spool, maximum boost pressure that they're asking of them. Once they're at sort of like 3,000 to 4,000 RPM, there's not a lot of difference between throttle on, throttle off. And the reason they've done that is for response. They want to make sure that the engine is predictable and linear, because it feels kind of fun. It feels very nice and pure, and yeah, it's got a good feel to it. that's not to say that turbos don't have a good feel, because it is pretty fun waiting for the boost to kick in. So here's an example. You can see the power and torque meters, so you can see that my throttle is partially down. I'd say it's, the power dial is probably more closely related to my throttle position than the torque. The torque is obviously just spikes up as soon as you touch the throttle. But you can see there's a boost gauge down there that hasn't even moved. Admittedly, I'm only doing 1500 RPM, and it's hard to spool the turbo at super low revs. But you need at least a reasonable amount of gas flowing through the turbine to spool up the turbo. So what I'll do is I'll chuck it back into sport gearing, which holds the revs slightly higher. You can see it's at about 1100 RPM at the moment. And you'll see the revs as they build eventually there it is, there's a bit of boost. So this is very light throttle. I'm at maybe 5%, maybe this is 10 now, 20%, 30%. You can see that there's a strong relationship between boost and throttle position, and there's also a relationship between boost and RPM. So right now, if I were to put it into manual mode, and then we'll drop it down in a second. So my throttle is completely off, there is no boost. My throttle is light, so we're hitting a lot more revs, and yet, even though I'm at 4500 RPM, I'm still making very little boost. And no, that's not because this car makes boost right at the top of its rev range, because it doesn't. It makes boost right at the bottom, actually. It's really quite difficult to do this. So to see what kind of car this is, because you say, oh, maybe it's a super laggy car, but it's not. It's actually ridiculous. If I put my foot down first, you can see that it builds boost very low in the rev range, and it builds it very quickly. So another example you can see is how much faster, if you're already doing, let's say, 3000 RPM, 3500 RPM or so. If I put my foot down, you can see there's just a tiny bit of boost there. If I put my foot down, the boost builds very quickly. And that's because the boost map isn't one-dimensional. It's not just based on revs. It's three-dimensional. It's based on revs and throttle position. And you could probably put a fourth dimension of current boost pressure, because it kind of cycles back on top of itself, and more boost equals more exhaust equals more boost. Kind of winds itself up. But it has less of an effect on cars, especially like this one. There are things you can do to mitigate the spill time. For example, in this RS3, something that I've just found out is that it has anti-lag. So for example, if I'm in second, I drop down. Yeah, it has anti-lag. That's kind of ridiculous. That's not something you'd find generally in a car from the factory. I'm not even sure how safe it is to do. Obviously, since it is built in from the factory, they have a certain level of confidence that it's safe enough to use occasionally, and I don't do it all the time, I do it occasionally. So I have quite high confidence that it's not a big deal, but obviously if you did it 5 times a day, every day, you'd probably end up doing a bit of damage to the turbo.
Okay, let's take a car like, for example, the RS3. It has a torque curve that looks something a bit like this. Where this is torque in, let's say, Newton meters. That's an M. And this is RPM. Now, this is the torque you get at the maximum possible boost at that RPM at full throttle. If you take away the boost provided by the turbo, pretend, for example, you disconnected the turbo and for some reason it ran and didn't throw error codes and it was all good, the engine would very likely make a power curve something like this. So you can see the difference there is down low is very high. The RS3 comes on maximum boost at around 2500 RPM. So let's say that's about 2500 RPM there. Now you can see there's this gap here. This gap between maximum power with turbo and maximum power without turbo is pretty much the gap you'll see between when you stab your throttle down at any given RPM and the peak power you would have if you had already been on boost. Now let's take, for example, if you're at 2500 RPM, right here, and you mash the throttle. So you're cruising 2500 RPM, you're not really doing anything, just light, just transient throttle, and then you just slam your throttle down. What happens is boost will take some time to build because there's not enough gases flowing through the turbine to spool it up instantaneously, so it has to build. You get something along those lines. Now lag is the distance between when you first put your foot down and when you reach peak boost. The time it takes to get here could be, in the case of an RS3, just ballpark guess, it's maybe from 2500 RPM, maybe 1 second, or yeah, but let's say 1 second. The further along you are in the curve, the less time it's going to take to build boost, and therefore the less lag you're going to notice. So say you started later at the rev range, let's say like 5,000 RPM. So you start here, because you're already pushing a lot more power through the engine's already much more efficient, it'll spool the turbo much faster. So the speed of spool is basically the angle of this slope here. So it would be something more like a much more violent angle. Now it has less distance to cover as well, so it doesn't have to spin as far, and because it's getting much more gases, it spins up quicker. So you end up with a much shorter, still lag, but it's more like, let's say that's a second, so that's like 0.4 seconds ballpark. So it doesn't matter where you are in the rev range, you're always going to have some level of lag in a car like this one. There are some cars that it's almost entirely mitigated, and that's based on the fact that they have a smaller turbo compared to the size of the engine, but in the vast majority of cars you're going to always have some lag. Now that's obviously impacted by the quality of the turbo or the engineering that's been gone into the turbo and the whole engine as a package. In the case of the RS3, it's very little lag, so 0.4 seconds, honestly it's probably even less than that, it's probably more like 0.2 seconds. But there's always some. You're never going to get away from it without having an enormous engine and a tiny turbo, but obviously that means you're going to have the reduced benefits of boost. The whole point of boost is you add more boost, you get more power, but you add more boost, you get more lag. That's just inherent. So, in the case of the RS3, and basically every car like it, you can't get rid of lag anywhere on the rev range, but the lag will reduce the higher up in the revs you go. So let's say from basically idle, say this is idle here, 800. You're going from here to maximum boost. Now maximum boost is actually at 2500 RPM approximately. So it's going to feel basically the same no matter what, like as just a full power run from nothing, because it is from nothing, and that's where your maximum lag is going to be. And in this case, it's going to be from there to there, it's going to be like 1, maybe 2, even 2 seconds based on sort of how long it takes. It might delay that, it might take a little bit to catch up. So it can take all of your time, all of your lag time is sort of down in the bottom end. Whereas once you're up higher, it takes much less time to spool the turbo and you get less lag. But yes, the critical point is that you always get lag. And that's it.